Imagine this: a young woman, dressed in white, her hands shaking as the crowd watches in silence. She's led to a deep pit just outside the walls of Rome. Inside, a bed, a lamp, a little food, and nothing else. She climbs down. The earth closes over her. The sound of stones and dirt seals her fate. No blood, no blade, no screams. Just the slow, suffocating horror of being buried alive. This wasn't the fate of a criminal. It was the fate of a Vestal Virgin, Rome's most sacred women. And this is how Rome punished them when they failed. She was only a child, maybe 7, maybe 10, when Rome decided her fate, not for her beauty, not for her family's ambition, but for her purity. The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's high priest, would step into a crowd of trembling girls and point. With a single gesture, her life was over. She was now a Vestal Virgin. Her parents often wept, because once chosen, she no longer belonged to them. She was stripped from her family, her name erased, her childhood stolen. From that day, she belonged to the goddess Vesta and to the state of Rome. She crossed the sacred road for the last time as a daughter and entered the Atrium Vestae, the house of the Vestals, where her body and soul would be locked away for 30 years. For 10 years, she learned in silence. 10 years, she served as the guardian of Rome's eternal flame. 10 years, she trained others. No freedom, no love, no marriage. Not even the chance to touch a man's hand. Her body wasn't her own. Her breath, her thoughts, her purity, all property of Rome. The people bowed to her in public, but in truth, she was a prisoner in white robes. Revered, yes, but watched like a hawk. Because for a Vestal, one mistake could unleash punishments worse than death. To the Roman people, the Vestal Virgins looked untouchable. Pure white robes, jewels, and the honor of front row seats at the Colosseum. But behind the sacred walls, their lives were ruled by fear. 3 laws bound them: guard the sacred fire, obey without question, stay chaste for 30 years. Break any one of these, and the price was torment. If the eternal flame ever went out, it was a disaster for Rome. But it wasn't the gods who punished, it was men. A Vestal found guilty of neglect would be dragged into a secret chamber, where the Pontifex Maximus himself would scourge her with rods. Always in total darkness, so no man could see her sacred body. She was beaten blind, stripped not of her clothes but of her dignity, until blood ran unseen across the floor. Even rumors were enough. A whisper that she'd spoken too freely to a man could bring her before the priests. Innocence didn't matter. Her silence was her only defense. Rome judged her not by truth, but by suspicion. And if she broke her vow of chastity, if she dared to know the touch of a man, the punishment was beyond torture. She would be buried alive. No screaming arena, no public bloodshed. Instead, solemn silence. They said her blood was too sacred to spill, so they entombed her under the earth, alive. The law claimed it was mercy. But mercy in Rome was colder than death. Rome called it a bloodless punishment, but nothing about it was merciful. When a Vestal Virgin was accused of breaking her vow of chastity, the verdict was already decided. There was no trial, no defense, only a ritual, calm, cold, and more terrifying than death itself. The condemned Vestal was dressed in her sacred white robes, veiled like a bride. But this was no wedding. This was her funeral. A solemn procession led her through the Roman Forum. No crowds shouted. No one dared to weep. The silence was heavy, broken only by the shuffle of her bare feet against the stone. She carried nothing, because she had already been stripped of her name, her honor, her very place in the world. At the edge of the city, they reached the Campus Celeratus, the field of the wicked. There, beneath the earth, a chamber had been dug. Inside was a bed, a lamp, bread, water, and milk. Not kindness, not comfort. Just the illusion that Rome was not guilty of murder. The Pontifex Maximus raised his hands. The ceremony was short. No prayers, no forgiveness. She descended the steps, her veil trembling with each breath. For the last time, she saw the sun. For the last time, she heard the sound of Rome alive above her. The entrance was sealed with earth. Stones slammed down, dust filled her lungs. Darkness swallowed her whole. Inside she waited. Hours, maybe days. Alone, no air, no hope. Some clawed at the walls until their fingernails tore away. Some prayed until their voices broke. Some simply lay down, waiting for the slow suffocation to end them. The Romans insisted it was not execution. They said her life was left to the gods. But everyone knew the truth. She wasn't judged by heaven. She was buried alive by men. The story of the Vestal Virgins wasn't just myth. Real women lived it. Real women died in it. And their names are still carved into Rome's history. In 216 BCE, during Rome's darkest days of the Second Punic War, two Vestals, Opimia and Floronia, were accused of breaking their vow of chastity. The charges were incestum, sacrilege against the goddess Vesta herself. Floronia, knowing what awaited her, took her own life before the state could touch her. But Opimia was dragged through the forum, veiled in white, her silence heavier than any chain. She was led to the campus Celleratus. The pit had already been dug. The food, the water, the lamp, all laid out like props in a cruel play. Witnesses said her veil trembled as she descended into the chamber. Some claimed she cried. Others swore she walked without a sound. It didn't matter. Once the stones sealed the entrance, her fate was the same. Buried alive, forgotten by the world above. And she was not the only one. Records tell of another Vestal Minutia condemned for wearing clothes. Too fine, accused of tempting men with her beauty. Rome stripped her of honor, dressed her in rags, and buried her alive beneath the earth. Every time, the Romans repeated the same lie. No blood had been spilled. But the truth is darker. These women clawed at the earth until their fingers snapped. They screamed in the dark where no one could hear them. They died slowly, suffocating in silence, martyrs to a purity they never asked for, victims of a city that worshipped them until it destroyed them. Rome loved its symbols. But when those symbols cracked, Rome crushed them. Rome demanded that its Vestal Virgins embody absolute purity. 30 years of untouched chastity. 30 years of silence, obedience, and servitude. For the Romans, one whisper of impropriety from a Vestal could mean the gods were angry. That disaster loomed. That the empire itself trembled on the brink of ruin. And yet the men of Rome, who enforced this purity, lived by an entirely different code. Senators who demanded virtue from tenure, old girls held banquets dripping in wine, slaves and sex. Priests who flogged Vestals for failing their sacred duties kept mistresses in secret. Emperors, from Augustus to Elagabalus, indulged in affairs, orgies, and violence with little more than scandal to pay for it. The hypocrisy was staggering. A Vestal could be condemned to death for speaking too freely with a man. But a senator could rape a slave in his own atrium and face no consequence. A Vestal's single mistake was called incestum, an abomination against the gods. But Rome's elite men indulged in endless incest, adultery, and violence, excused as privilege of their status. The women bore the weight of the gods' anger. The men drank, feasted, and killed in their name. The sacred fire that Vestals tended symbolized Rome's eternal survival. If it went out, blame fell not on the corruption of emperors, not on the cruelty of senators, not on the wars Rome started. No, blame fell squarely on the shoulders of young women. Girls taken from their families before they were even old enough to understand what their vows meant. This was Rome's true hypocrisy. The purity of a child mattered more to the state than the crimes of the men who ruled it. The fate of Vestals shows us that Rome did not worship gods. Rome worshipped power. And the Vestal Virgins were its most sacred sacrifices. Alive, silent, buried beneath the weight of male corruption. For Rome, the eternal flame inside the temple of Vesta was more than fire. It was destiny. As long as that flame burned, Rome would stand. But if it ever went out, it was seen as a curse, a message from the gods that Rome itself was failing. And who carried this impossible weight? Not emperors, not generals, not senators, but young girls, children chosen to be Vestals. Imagine being 12 years old, barely tall enough to reach the altar, and knowing that if your flame died, the wrath of the entire empire would fall on you. One mistake, one moment of weakness, one breath too slow, and Rome would decide you were guilty of betraying the gods themselves. When the sacred flame flickered out, punishment was immediate. The Pontifex Maximus, the most powerful priest in Rome, would drag the Vestal into the darkness of a hidden chamber. No public trial, no mercy, only pain. The beating was always done in secret. Why? Because the Vestals were supposed to be sacred, untouchable, honored by the gods. Rome could not let the public see its holy women stripped and broken. So, the whip fell in the shadows. Ancient writers describe it coldly, scourging in total darkness. A priest's hand clutching the rods. The sound of wood striking flesh. A sacred woman sobbing into the black silence. Rome pretended to protect her dignity, but dignity does not exist when blood runs down your back. And yet, this torment was considered merciful compared to what came next if her failure was greater. If the fire went out more than once, or if whispers of impurity reached the ears of the Senate, the Vestal's chastity itself would be questioned. This was the cruel balance of Rome. The same girl who was paraded through the streets in white robes, honored as the guardian of the flame, could be dragged away at night, whipped until her skin split, and silenced before dawn. For 30 years, Vestals lived with this unrelenting terror. Every day spent staring into the sacred fire, knowing that if it dimmed even for a moment, her body would pay the price. Rome called it religion. But for the women trapped in that temple, it was slavery wrapped in ceremony, purity enforced by the lash. The Vestals were supposed to belong to the gods, pure, sacred, above politics. But in Rome, nothing was ever above politics. Senators, generals, emperors, men who saw the Vestals not as holy women, but as weapons. A single accusation of impurity could ruin a rival's career, topple his family's honor, even justify his execution. And the Vestals, they became the perfect victims. Imagine this: you are a Vestal, sworn to 30 years of chastity. One whisper that you had looked too long at a man, one rumor spread by an enemy of the Pontifex, and your entire life collapsed. You weren't granted a trial like other citizens. You weren't allowed to speak in your own defense. Rome judged you guilty before you ever opened your mouth. The punishment was ritualized horror. Rome couldn't spill the blood of a Vestal. She was too sacred for that. So, they invented a punishment that was worse than death. First, you were dressed in your white robes one final time. A funeral procession followed you through the streets, but instead of tears of grief, the crowd stared with a mixture of silence and dread. They knew they were watching a sacrifice. At the city's edge stood a secret chamber dug deep into the ground. A small cell, barely large enough to lie down in, lined with stone. There was a couch, a single lamp, a few crumbs of bread, and that was all. The Vestal was led inside, and the entrance was sealed with earth and stones. Alive, she was buried, entombed in silence, her body left to starve in the suffocating dark. Roman writers tell us the crowd always dispersed in silence afterward. No cheers, no chants, only dread. Because every Roman knew they had just watched a girl transformed from goddess to corpse. And here's the cruelest twist. Many of these crimes were never proven. They were political, convenient lies. A Vestal buried alive wasn't just punished. It was a message, a warning. Rome had shown the people that no one, not even the most sacred virgin, was safe from its power. The Vestals from bodies were not only symbols of purity. They were tools of intimidation. Their suffering kept the balance of fear, and Rome thrived on fear.